We are live, I think. Can you guys hear me? You can see here that we're live, so hopefully it's all good. Let me know when you guys can hear me, if you can. We can, that's good. Thank you guys, thank you for joining in. Thanks for tuning into this live stream. We actually planned this live stream just a few days ago because quite a few of you guys were wanting to create sort of interactive apps for your users, and some people were using tkinter, which is a graphical user interface framework for Python. Others were using console apps like text apps, and others were making web apps. And we do quite a lot of web app development, so I figured out that this could be a good workshop for us to run. So thank you guys for tuning in. If I look away, it's because I'm looking at the chat, by the way. So we've got quite a few things planned, but what you're seeing right now in front of you, as well as me, is the design for the project that we're going to be building. So this project is a simple project, but nonetheless, there's a lot of stuff to cover. So what we've got is this is going to be a website. And by the way, here I'm on a design tool. So our site is not going to look like this. It's just going to look like this box here. Good afternoon, Andy. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you guys for tuning in. What we've got here is our website, and it's got a couple of parts. So the main parts of this website are the header, which are these pieces of text here and this icon. Then we've got the main body of the app, which allows us to write a log. This is going to be a programming sort of blog or journal application. So you can write your log here, you can submit it. When you submit it, a new entry will be created and it will be shown up here. The entries have a couple of parts. They've got some sort of heading and then the date at which the button was pressed. And then they've got the body of the entry that we wrote up here. So as you write more entries, they're going to be stored and they're going to be shown on this page. And then the final part is this footer down here that just links away to like other projects and maybe your portfolio, and it's got some links and whatnot. So add set on what site can we follow along? You can't follow along with the coding per se. We're going to be writing the code here on my computer, but you can watch and then I will share the final code. I've got a GitHub repository with the final code that I will send after when we get to that part. And so we're going to start actually by how you should start with something like this. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new project. I'm going to call it microblog, and I'm going to open that. I'm using Visual Studio Code in here, just in case you guys are wondering. We're going to zoom in a bit so you guys can see. And what we're going to start off with is by creating app.py. So in app.py, we're going to be writing most of our code, and you should always start one of these applications by thinking about what you want the users to be able to do. And it helps when you're creating something like a Flask app to not necessarily start creating the website and styling it and dealing with Flask and all that to begin with. So we're going to start by creating a simple console app, and then we're going to turn that console app into a web app. And that process is going to show us really what Flask is for. So we're going to start by just creating the console app, which is going to be really straightforward. We're going to have a set of entries. This is going to be a list. And here we're going to put the content and the date of each entry. Then we're going to sort of ask the user whether they want to enter a new entry. So we'll do something like user selection is going to be an input of enter A to add an entry, or Q to quit. For many of you, this will be nothing new. We're just using the input function to get some user input, and then we're going to get a string back from the user, and that's going to go into our variable. So we can do while user selection is not Q, then we will ask them to enter a new entry. and after they've entered an entry, we're going to ask them again for some more input so that we can decide whether to repeat the loop or not. Yep, the stream will last around 3 hours. We may finish a little bit earlier, but yeah, that's what we've got scheduled at least. And so here we've got our menu, and then all we have to do is say if the user selection is equal to A, then we're going to add a new entry. And what we'll do when we want to add a new entry is we're going to essentially ask the user for the entry content. So we say entry content is input something like what did you learn today? And we'll do entries.append entry content. Then when they press Q to quit, the loop will terminate. And what we're going to do down here, just so we can see what we've done, is we're going to print entries. So that's the contents of the list that we've been appending to over and over again. Okay, now I'm just going to open up a terminal down here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a virtual environment for this project. A virtual environment is just a copy of Python that we can install new libraries and things into without installing them in other installations of Python that we have in our computer. So we'll do pipenv install, and we're going to do pipenv install Flask. And what that's going to do, if you have pipenv installed, is it's going to create a virtual environment and it's going to install Flask in it. We're just doing that because we're going to need it later on. Uchiha Itachi, we are making a microblog because it's the easy way to get started. But actually later on, we have a slightly more interesting screen that we won't get to in this tutorial, but that will be part of our complete Python web course that we're working on at the moment. So this should be a bit more interesting. But yeah, Phil is absolutely correct. It's less about making the site and more about learning about the different parts involved. All right, so doing pipenv install, we've ended up with our virtual environment created and a couple of files have been created in our project. That's totally normal. And what these files just have is that we've installed Flask. And whenever we want to reinstall things for our project, we'll just install the things that are defined in this file. And pipenv will know that you need Flask. So now that we've got a virtual environment, all we have to do in our console is do pipenv run python app.py. And that's going to use the virtual environment we've created. That's what pipenv run does to execute this command. So python app.py, and that's going to execute our app. So you can see our app, pretty straightforward, asks us to add or quit, and we're going to type A. Then we can type what we learned today. Today I learned how to schedule a YouTube live broadcast, which is true. So we learned that. And you can add more if you want, and as you can see, the loop is just going to keep repeating and repeating until the user selection is equal to Q, and then it's going to end. And you can see that we've got a list down here. This is this print that has a single string inside it, and that's the entry. So why are we doing this instead of just jumping in straight to Flask? Like I said earlier, because now we know what sort of data we're going to be dealing with in our Flask app. Earlier on, we also mentioned that the Flask app was going to have a date. So we're going to be working with the date as well in here while it's simple rather than jumping in straight to Flask. So in order to work with dates in Python, the easiest way is to import the datetime module. And here in the entries.append, we're going to stop appending just the string of what they learned today. Now we're going to append a dictionary that has content associated with the entry content, and then also the date, which is associated with today's date. So that's datetime.datetime.today.strftime, and it's going to be %d, %b, and that's it. So a couple of things going on in here. We have datetime.datetime. This accesses the datetime object inside the datetime module, and that object has a method called today that gives us today's date. Then by doing strftime, we're doing string format time, and we're going to format this date that we've got using this string format. And what this means is we're going to do, actually the other way around, b%d. We're going to do today's, or the day as a number, for example, 5. And then %d is the month as 3 letters. So this could be, for example, 5 October, or 5 oct, rather. And so now whenever we add a new entry, we're putting the content that the user typed, and we're also putting today's date as a string. So let me save that and run it so you can see what it looks like. We're going to add a new entry. I learned about %b and %d, and then we're going to quit. And then you can see that here we've got the content, and then we've got the date. These two things are in a dictionary, which is inside the entries list. All right, so this is what our Flask app is going to deal with. So up till now, we've had two main parts of our application. There is a part that does some data processing, and there is a part that does some user processing or user interaction. And so the part that does data processing is quite simple. It's this bit here mostly, and it also has some user input in there as well. Essentially what it does is it takes the user input and it puts it into some sort of data storage that our application has. You can think of it as a database, although it is going to disappear when you close the app. You could save this into a file or a proper database, and we'll learn how to do that later on. So that is the data processing side of things. The rest of our application is involved with user input and output. So we've got some ability for the user to type things and give us information, and we're then going to use it inside our application, and at the end we're also displaying some information to the user. So what we've got there is this simple sort of client to app relationship, if you will. The user is sending us some information, and the app, in this case, our Python app, is receiving it and is doing something with it. If you don't have pipenv, that's totally fine. You can use virtualenv if you know how to use that, or you can just install Flask directly on your Python installation. That's totally fine as well. No problem at all. I'm just using pipenv, so it's a little bit easier to keep things separate. All right, so we have our app. Now we're going to go ahead and learn about how a web application is different from this application we've got here. So I'm just going to bring up this thing here. So let's talk about the flow of data between servers and clients. I'm going to move myself away so you guys can see a bit better. And so what I talked about just now is how the user is giving us some information and our application is receiving it and is processing it. And so when you talk about web application development, you have a very similar relationship between servers and clients. In our application, the client was the user because they were typing directly into our app. But in a web app, it's going to be slightly different. So what is a server? A server is very simple. It's an app that accepts data and then processes it. It can do calculations, it can store things to a database, it can send emails or tweets, or it can do whatever, but it receives data and then it can process it and then finally returns something back. So that's a server application. You can think of the app we just wrote as somewhat of a server in that it does these things. But normally you talk about servers in the context of web interactions, not of normal Python app interactions. So I wouldn't call the app we just developed a server, but a server just does these three things. So if that's a server, then what's a client? A client is an app that sends data to a server. And so in this case, the user of our app just a moment ago was not a client because they weren't sending data to a server, since our app was not a server. But when we talk about web applications, the client is going to be another application that sends data to the server. and the client expects the server to respond. And usually clients do more than just send data. So they can get user input, they can display information to users, they can do anything that your app might want to do. So your client is going to be what the user interacts with, and then you're going to have another separate app that is what receives the data and deals with it. So how do these two interact? Usually through the internet. The client will send some data to the computer running the server code. And so you're going to have your client app, your user is going to interact with the client, and then the client is going to send data to the server. The server is going to process it and it's going to send some data back. So the computer that is running the server code will be configured so that when it receives data, it will redirect it or send that data to the server code that you wrote. And so this happens over the internet, and sending data is called making a request. So the client asks the server to do something, so it requests some action. And when the server sends data back, that's called a response. And because it happens over the internet, they often use hypertext transfer protocol. That's just a set of rules that dictate how the data is sent, but you don't have to worry about it. So the computer running the server is going to be your computer while you write the Flask app. And whenever you run the Flask app, that is going to automatically configure your computer so that any requests that are sent to your computer will be sent to your Flask code. Your computer's web address is always http://127.0.0.1. We're going to look at that in just a moment. So again, you're going to write a Flask app, and I'm going to show you how. You're going to run it, and then your computer is going to be able to accept incoming data from a client, and then your Python code that is inside that Flask app will be able to deal with that data. So who's the client? Well, here's the thing. Users, when they interact with websites, don't interact with websites directly. They use a browser. So the client in our apps, and especially in websites, are almost always users' browsers. Whenever you navigate to any address using a browser, that's actually sending a request to the server. It's asking the server for some data. So our user is going to navigate to our web address. That's 127.0.0.1. The browser is going to make a request, and the server is going to respond. So the server will get requests for a particular endpoint or a part of a web address. I'm sure you've seen stuff like these things in websites before, like facebook.com/home, for example, and that is a particular endpoint inside facebook.com. And in our server, we'll be able to define specific paths or endpoints, and we will be able to write Python code that responds to a request in each of them. So here's what happens at the end of it. To clarify, the browser navigates to, let's say, 127.0.0.1/home. So what happens is the browser sends a request to 127.0.0.1 using hypertext transfer protocol, and part of the data included in that request is /home. That's what we've actually asked for. That data will arrive at our Flask code, and Flask will then run a particular Python function. When we get that request, we will be able to do any processing that we want. We'll just be writing Python code at this stage. We can run different functions for different endpoints, and eventually we're going to return some data to the browser, and the browser is going to process it, and it's going to decide what to do with it. So what data will we return? When we were making websites, we're always going to be returning HTML. So that's another language, and when a browser receives HTML, it can process it and it can convert it to things that users want to see, like boxes or text and so on. And the HTML code can also contain CSS and JavaScript. CSS is used to change the style of HTML elements. JavaScript is used to run code in the browser. So remember that our Python code, that is our Flask app, runs in the server's computer, and the JavaScript code, if we do use any, runs in the client, so in the browser. So that's just something to remember. But let's get started with making this Flask app, and it's all going to be a bit clearer as we move along. So Andy Max asks, is Flask an API or a new code language? Flask is a library that allows us to define the functions that will run when data is incoming. So I'm going to rename this app.py just to something like old app.py, and I'm going to create a new app.py. And in this new app.py, we're going to do from Flask import Flask. It's important to use the lowercase f initially, since that is the package, and the uppercase f later, since that's the class that we're importing. Now, the first thing to do when you're creating a Flask app is to actually create an app. So we'll do Flask, and then we'll do __ name. What this does is it uses the Flask code that somebody else has written and creates something that we can use to define those functions that will run when we receive data. So this app here, you can think of it as the thing that is the server code. Then we're going to do something like def home, and this is just a traditional Python function. And what this function is going to do is going to return the string hello world. Now, here we've done three things. We've imported Flask, we've created the Flask app, and we've defined a normal, good old Python function that returns a string. So nothing magical is going on in here. But we do have to do something, which is tell the app that this function should run when the app receives data from the client. And the way we do that in Flask is with a decorator. And if you're not sure what these are, don't worry too much about it. But we're going to do the @ symbol app.route, and then in brackets, the string /home. So this looks familiar already. This is that endpoint that we're going to be making requests to through the browser. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to bring back the terminal, and I'm going to run the app again. But now remember that app.py is this new Flask app. If I run Python app.py, you'll see that immediately it terminates. That's because this app, as you can see, just defines a function and it doesn't really do anything else. We're not using the function, we're not calling it anywhere, so naturally there's no output. Flask, though, ships with a tool called the Flask command line interface. It's a bit of a long name, but what you can do is you can say pip and run, and that means we're going to run the next command inside the virtual environment, and then you can type flask run, and that is going to execute your app. So what that's doing is that configuration that allows your computer to receive requests and sends that data to our code. Now, the important part here is that we get this address here running on http://127.0.1:5000. So earlier on I said that your computer's address was going to be 127.0.0.1. Flask is now telling us that it is 127.0.0.1:5000. So we do need the entire thing there. And what we're going to do is we're going to copy it. Then we're going to go over to our browser. And here we're going to do /home. Okay. So there we have our hello world. Notice that I've accessed 127.0.0.1:5000/home because that is the address that we defined in our Flask code. And we said that that function should return hello world, and Flask is the part responsible for handling that return to the browser. So anything that our function returns is going to get returned to the browser, and that's how we end up with hello world here. So hopefully this makes sense. And as you can see, if I bring this code back up, as you can see, there's nothing overly complicated going on here once you understand the different concepts involved in one of these apps. Anything that this endpoint returns will be sent to the browser. So if we send back some HTML, the browser is then going to be capable of interpreting it and showing us HTML code. Now, if you guys are not familiar with HTML code or CSS code, don't worry, we're going to go over what they are. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new folder in our app, and I'm going to call it templates. And it's very important in Flask that this folder be called templates. And inside the templates folder, I'm going to create something called home.html. Notice that Visual Studio Code, and probably your editor of choice as well, already knows that this is going to be an HTML file, and so it'll be able to highlight syntax and things like that. By the way, I'm noticing that I was missing, so I'm back now. So here in home.html, we're going to be writing some HTML code. But what we can do is we can right-click home.html and reveal in the Explorer, and that is just going to bring up the page here, and you can open it with your browser of choice. So here we've got the home.html file that we've opened in the browser, and you can see that at the moment it's empty, so there's nothing inside it. But if you write hello here, and then you come back and you refresh, you can see that hello appears there. So we're going to be writing some content inside home.html, and then we're going to make sure that it's working in our browser before making Flask use it. Because at the moment, Flask is not using home.html at all. In fact, we can stop the Flask app if you want, and that's totally fine. So browsers can interpret HTML code. If you open an HTML file with your browser, it's going to be able to read it and tell you what's in it and show you the contents. So you can do all sorts of stuff in here. But normally you start an HTML file with a doc type that tells the browser what type of HTML code we've got. So that is less than, exclamation mark, doc type, and then a space, HTML, and then a closing crocodile clip. Then we're going to have the HTML tag. And now you're starting to see the main structure of HTML documents. HTML documents use tags, and this is a tag, or more specifically, this is an opening tag, and this here is a closing tag because it has this / before the tag name. And so in HTML, we place things inside tags. The HTML tag is the main tag in an HTML document, and we just put everything inside of it. And then we've got a body tag into which we place the things that the user will be able to see. Okay, so here, for example, we could place something like the microblog text that was our main application text. And then if we save that and we refresh the page, you'll see microblogs there. And now all we have to do, which is easier said than done, is we have to construct an HTML document that allows our site to look like this. HTML documents define what is in the page. So, for example, an HTML document might define that this piece of text will be on the page, this piece of text will be on the page, and so will this piece, and so will this text box, and this button, and so on. But it won't define the color of the button, or the size of the text, or the transparency in this text, and so forth. And those things are left for CSS, or the style sheets. So, let's get started, and I'm going to open that up. So now what we're going to do is we're going to start by defining a special type of HTML tag, which is the div tag. So a div tag is what's known as a block of HTML content. If I save this here, well, I'm going to put some content in here inside the tag. If I save this tag here, and then I'm going to go over to my browser again, then I'm going to refresh, and you see that absolutely nothing's changed. But now what we can do in browsers, this is really cool, is you can right-click it and inspect, if you're using Chrome, which I would recommend. And then you can see that this tag here, that I know is a bit small, and maybe you can't see it that well. There you go. Then this is the structure of our HTML document. So we've got the doc type at the top, then we've got the HTML tag, And when you select it or when you hover over it, Chrome will automatically show you the space that this tag is occupying on the page. So the HTML tag is occupying that entire blue strip. Then we've got the head tag that was added automatically. And we've got the body tag. And the body tag, you can see, occupies more or less the same amount of room. But now there are two colors in there. We're going to look at what those mean in a moment. And then you've got the div tag inside it that occupies a little bit less room, but still takes up the entire width of the page. If we go back to our code and we change the div tag for something called a span tag, and I'm just doing this to show you what these tags do. Now notice that if I refresh, now we have a span, and the span tag does not occupy the entire width of the page. It only occupies as much space as the text inside it requires. That is because divs are block elements and spans are inline elements. But before we continue down that route, I'm going to show you something more. So now we must talk about the CSS box model. In CSS, there are a few attributes that you need to know about. The first one is the content. The content is essentially all of the text or images or other things that you have inside a tag. In our case, the microblog text was the content of both the div and the span. Then you've got some padding that can be around the content. And you can put as much or as little padding as you want. This just can add a bit of space around the content. Then after the padding, you can have some border. For example, you can have a thick black border like one you see here. You can have an invisible border. You can have a very thin border. You can have no border at all if you want. And that again adds some extra space, potentially with some color outside of the padding. And finally, after the border, you have the margin, which can again add some more space. You can use padding, border, and margin to separate elements within a page. So that's the different parts there, the content, the padding, the border, and the margin. So you have two types of elements. You have block elements that fill up all the available width. So that's what we saw earlier on when we had our div. And these will break into a new line if their width exceeds the available width. So if we had a lot of text on that div or in that div, then that text would break into the next line. And one more benefit of block elements is that you can manually set their size if you want. Then you got inline elements that don't break into new lines, and you cannot manually set the width and the height. So which is which? Because there are a lot of elements in HTML. And you just have to try them, look at them, and learn them. There's so many elements that I couldn't possibly tell you all of them, but yeah. Block elements are going to be things like divs, headings, paragraphs, stuff like that that you normally wanted to occupy its own space, if you will. And inline elements are going to be things like links, that's an anchor, a span, emphasis, strong, things that normally you'd think of being inside something else. So that's sort of the conceptual difference between the two, although, as you know, there are some other differences too. Finally, we come to the width and height. When you've got width and height, normally CSS elements are sized based on their content. So if you have an element and you say you want that element to be 200 pixels wide by 150 pixels high, what you're setting as the size is the content. And then if you add any padding or borders, then those are going to be extra. And you've also got the other way of sizing elements, which is border box, and we're going to talk about that later on, which is that when you define the size of an element, then that size includes the border and the padding. I'm going to show you what these look like when we get to developing. But I thought this was important to know about before we got started. All right, so let's go ahead and build the HTML structure that we will use for our page. I'm hearing some, what do we do now? I feel like I've missed something in the chat. What do we do now? We're going to build the HTML structure. So I hope that's what you meant. But yeah, so we've got our microblog text here. We're going to be replacing it for some divs. So we're going to have a div that is going to be the logo. So I'm just going to type logo in here, and we're going to look at how to include an image in a page in just a moment. And then we're going to have another div which is going to be for the menu items. So that is the recent and the calendar. So going back here, we're going to have another div inside it for recent and another div inside it for calendar. And in here, we're going to have logo, and then we're going to have microblog. Okay, so we've got now a structure for our HTML. We've got, I'm going to get rid of this span, by the way. Actually, no, I'm not. I'm going to change it for a div. So we've got in our HTML a container or a div, a block of HTML. And inside that block, we've got a few more blocks. The first one contains the logo, text, and the microblog, which is the title of our site. And then we've got another block, and inside it, there are some more blocks that have the recent and the calendar menu items. So if we save that and we go and open it, you'll see that it looks nothing like what we wanted. So the reason for that is because these are all block elements, so all of them take up 100% of the available width. So the logo microblog div element takes up 100% of the available width, and therefore the next element on the page must be below it, because there's no space beside it, since it's already taken up all the width. So this div also takes up all of the available width, and inside the div we have other divs, and they also take up 100% of the available width. And so again, these all appear top to bottom. But this is a small problem that we're going to solve later on using CSS. So for now, we've got our header of our application. And I know that this doesn't look too impressive, but just bear with me for a few moments. The next part of our app is going to be the main area. So we're going to define another div for the form. And in here, we're going to put a form tag. A form tag is another tag like the div, but it has some meaning in that you can have buttons and input fields and things like that inside forms. And so inside the form, we're going to have a text area. And below the text area, we're going to have an input. And here we're going to learn about our first HTML attribute. These HTML tags can contain extra data that will modify how they behave. So the input tag is used for the user entering some input or clicking something. And input tags often have a type. So you can do input and then space, type, equal, and we're going to do submit. Now the input tag is one of the few tags that self-closes, or you don't put a closing tag after it like this. You don't do that with input tags because you can never put anything between the tags. It's just not valid HTML. So what you do is you do a self-closing tag where you put the / and the greater than symbol there at the end. And this is a single tag that closes itself. So I'm going to press save now and go back to the browser so you can see what it's looking like. You can see that now we're getting a bit closer to what our application really looked like. Well, at least the contents of it. We've got our text area, and you can see that you can resize this text area, and this is part of the browser's functionality, so it's not something that we've coded ourselves. And then we've got your submit button, and when you click it, you'll see that something did happen. Although nothing changed in our page, we actually did refresh the page. If there had been something in this text area, for example, hello, then that content could be sent to the server that this is linked to. All right. So in order to be able to use the text area, we have to give it a name. So this is another attribute of the text area, and I'm going to call it content. Okay. Now, when we go back to our browser and we're going to refresh the page. Oh. Now, if we put hello in here, you can see that when we've given it a name, the address changes slightly. And I understand that this is a little bit small, but what you've got here is question mark content equal hello. That means that when you press the submit button, the contents of this text area were actually sent to the web address that you're currently in. Yeah, you can hide the chat, just full screen the video if you like. It may be easier to focus because we're going to cover quite a lot of stuff today. So now our form is actually handling the sending of the data, and the data was sent to the address that you're currently in. That's just the default behavior of forms. So when we're loading this page in our Flask application, our Flask app is going to be able to get that data somehow, and we're going to look at how. We're not going to be using Flask SQL Alchemy in this video. It's just a little bit too advanced for now. Okay, so we've got our form there. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and give some of these things a bit of style. So one of the best ways of giving style to elements in HTML is, one of the requirements before you can give styles to elements in HTML is that you have to be able to identify the element that you want to change. So, for example, we're going to go into this div that has the logo and microblog text, and we're going to do class equal title. And so we've added an attribute onto this div, and the attribute is class equal title. Now, when we write some CSS code, the CSS code, which is responsible for modifying the style of this HTML, will be able to say, find the element with class title and change it. Change its color or its font size and so on. So let's go ahead and do that. In order to be able to write some CSS, we're going to need a couple of things. The first one is we're going to need a head element. This is the counterpart to the body element, but the head element does not show up on the page. So here we're going to write some style, and this is another tag, and inside this tag you can write some code that will modify the HTML below it. So we're going to write some CSS code. We're going to do dot title, and what this does is it tells the CSS to find the elements that have a class of title. That's what the dot in front of it means. It means with a class of title. And in here, inside these brackets, we can write CSS rules or some things that will change. For example, font-size, we can write 24px. So here we've got our elements with a class of title are going to have a font size of 24 pixels. Okay, so let's save that, go back to our browser. And now you can see that the logo and the microblog have grown in size. Something you'll want to do as you develop web applications, especially if you have a design already made, is you want to make sure that you're using the right fonts and colors for your app. So in here, I can see that 24 pixels is correct. So that's why I'm going with that. All right. So we've learned about a few different parts involved in web development. We've got our HTML that mainly uses div elements to define the structure. You can usually use inline elements. We're going to learn about some of the other elements that we'll need as we move along. We've learned about forms and that they send data to the site that you're currently in when you press the submit button. And we've also learned a little bit about CSS and sort of how it works. You've got your class, and that identifies elements, and then inside the brackets you can put rules. And we don't know what rules are available to us, and that's just some part of the CSS learning that you'll have to do. But there's loads of different rules, and you can modify pretty much everything about an element using CSS. Okay, so now that we've got this here, we're going to go back into Flask, and instead of loading this home.html file using our browser, we're going to give the user that requests the home endpoint, we're going to give them the HTML file. And that way, we can make use of our Python code while sending them that data. So what we have to do is go ahead and from Flask, import Flask, and also render template. Render template is going to take the template name and is going to serve it to the user. So we'll put home.html in here, and notice that nowhere do we use the templates folder. That's the default folder name for templates in Flask. That's why it's so important that it is called templates. And Flask is automatically going to look for home.html inside the templates folder when you do render template. So now we can save that. We can open our terminal and we can run our Flask app. Then we can go back to our browser, and now we can close this tab that has the file open, and we can refresh our Flask app, which is 127.0.1:5000/home, and now you can see that it loads up. Everything looks a bit bigger because I'm zoomed in Chrome, just for you guys to see, but it really looks the same as before. I'm so confused by you guys in the chat. What are you talking about, gaming channels? Yes, Reagan, Mudberry, the Django tutorial, there's a wee bit left for that, I gotta say. I am interested in Django, but I haven't used it before. So, okay, so now we're able to serve our users with some HTML content. So the next step is going to be to, well, I'm going to get rid of this CSS there for now, since we don't actually need it for anything just yet. The next step is going to be to hook up our form that looks pretty terrible at the moment, but we're going to be styling it later on. We're going to hook it up with our Python code, so that when the user presses the submit button, then RJ Gaming, we're timing you out, pal. Don't don't go promoting your own channel in here. That's not the right place for it. All right, so we're gonna hook up the form so that when we get some data sent, when the user presses the submit button, our Python app will be able to see that data and store it. So the first thing that we're going to have to do here in the form is give it another attribute, which is method equal post. So what does post mean? And Devash is there any good tool to build HTML? No, not any good ones, I don't think. You'll have to do it by hand. So there are two main types of request. Actually, that's not really true. There are two main things that get sent together with the request: the contents of the request and the method of the request. So the content can be some data that is included in the form, or it can be some other information that the client wants to send. And the client can also decide to send requests with another piece of data, which is called the method. So two common methods are get and post. And these are just pieces of data included in the request, so they don't mean anything intrinsically. but servers are usually made to understand what these different types of requests mean. So normally servers use the GET request to return some information or some data. And servers normally use POST requests to receive some data from the client and then maybe create something in the server code. So we're going to follow that convention here, and we're going to go into our app.route decorator, and we're going to say methods equal, and then a list of get and post. Now, what that means is that this endpoint will be able to receive get requests and post requests. When we get a get request, we're going to give the user the template because they explicitly asked for some data. That's what the get request means. But when they send us a post request, we're going to assume that they have clicked the submit button in the form. And therefore, we will try to deal with the data that this form sent us. So what we have to do is up here from Flask, we're going to also import request. And we'll do that if request.method is equal to post, then we're going to sort of deal with the data that we've been sent. And if not, then we're going to return this render template there. So we'll do else return render template. Okay. Now, if we shut down our application and start it again, you'll see that this does exactly the same thing as before. So we can refresh. We've not really lost anything except some of the styling because we got rid of that. But you can see that the browser is making a GET request. It does that automatically for you whenever you access any website. So whenever you type any website in the address bar, the browser, before showing you the content, is making a GET request to the server for this specific endpoint. And the server is then usually responding you with some HTML. The browser is rendering the HTML or converting it into viewable things, and then you're seeing that. But whenever we submit here some content like hello, you'll see that we get an internal server error. And that is because our endpoint did not return anything when we got a post request. So going back here, the form makes a post request. So this endpoint is receiving a post request, and we have an if statement here that says, if the request method is post, then do nothing. Otherwise, if the request method was not post, then we'll return render template. And you can see down here, we get an error that says the view function did not return a valid response. Okay. So we do have to return something from here if we are going to use the post request. What we can do is we can start off by accessing the form content. So we'll do that the entry content is going to be request.form.get content. So request.form accesses the form payload or the data that's part of a form included in the request that we're currently receiving. And we're going to try to retrieve the content field from the form. So what happens in the HTML is the browser will construct some data that it's going to send to our server, and in that data is going to be essentially this content, which is the name of the text area, and is going to be associated with whatever we typed. So when we press submit, the content is going to be associated with what the user typed. We're going to be able to receive it in app.py and make use of it. And then we're going to add it to the entries list. So we're going to have an entries list in here, just as we did earlier on, and we're going to do entries.append the entry content. So notice we're not dealing with dates at the moment, just do the entry content. Now, here's something that we will want to do after we get some content. We will want to essentially send the users back to the page so that they can type some more content or at least see their entries. That's why after appending, we can do return render template home.html. So now you can see that both the post and the get requests are going to return render template of home.html. That means that we can essentially just get rid of these two lines and make our function always return the render template. Okay, let's stop the app and restart it. And then we're going to go back to our server. If you press refresh right now, Chrome at least will believe that you want to resubmit the form that you submitted last time that caused you to end up in this state. So we don't want to do that. What you want to do is go over to the URL and press enter. That's going to make another GET request. Otherwise, you'd be making a POST request. So we're going to type hello world in here. And now when we press submit, you'll see that seemingly nothing happens. However, believe me when I say that the entries list now has the content that you typed in. So what we can do is we can print entries here if you want to have a look at that. But when you modify the code, of course, you're going to have to stop the application and restart it, which means that the entries list will now be empty. You have to go back and type another one. And we press submit. Now you can see that the entries list down here contains the string that the user typed. So Ranjit, do we need to have a database to save this? Yes, you will need a database or a file in order to save the contents so that they stay with you between runs of the app. And Devashis, can we use a class to access the form? Nope, I don't think so. There are other ways of defining forms and interacting with them, but they use Flask extensions, and we're not going to look at those here. Okay, so we've got our entries now. The next thing we have to do is, of course, to show them in the template. So we're going to go over to home.html, and down here, well, I'm going to stop the app there. Down here, we're going to create another div for the entries. So you'll see that very often I'm creating divs for each separate section of my page. That's a fairly common approach. You want to be separating different parts so that then your CSS will be able to target different parts more effectively. We're going to learn more about that in just a moment. So I'm going to have a div here, and just to save myself time later on, I'm going to call it entries. So I'm going to give it a class of entries, again, so later on the CSS can target this and change the style. Now we're going to do something a little bit more magical, which is that this HTML template, earlier on, we opened in the browser. And we saw that the browser was able to render the contents of the HTML template and convert them into user viewable things. But now we are calling this render template function and sending the user the result of calling this. So what does this mean? Does this mean the HTML is already rendered and ready for the user to see before they receive it in their browser? No, that's not the case at all. Really, what's going on here is render template allows us to write some extra code inside the template called Jinja2 code, and that code will be able to do stuff. So what this code can do, for example, is do for entry in entries and then end for. And now this code here is called Jinja2 code. If you open this file with your browser directly, you'll see this as normal HTML text. And I'll show you what that looks like. Just like that. So nothing magical there, it's just text. But when you give this code to Flask, Flask will be able to understand what this code means, and that means that we are going to be able to iterate over each entry in the entries variable. So what's the entries variable? Well, we also have to pass it in to render template. So we'll say entries equal entries. And what this does is it defines the entries variable inside our template and gives it the value of the entries list. So if we save that and go over to home.html, now we can use the data in each entry to display it. So we're going to do P for the paragraph tag, and inside the paragraph tag, we're going to do curly brace entry close curly braces. So 2 curly braces on each side. This is some more Jinja 2 code that allows us to put some content into the HTML. And now what happens is Flask is going to calculate the output of this Jinja code first, and then it's going to send that calculated output to the browser. So Flask is going to be responsible for turning the Jinja code into HTML. Then the browser is going to take the HTML and the user is going to be able to see it. So I'm going to run the app again and go over to it here. Now I'm going to refresh. You can see that we see nothing here. But if I type hello world and press submit, you see that we've saved it there. And we can type more as well. So just taking a look at the chat. So India 2050, I'm not entirely sure what you mean. If you can ask in the Discord server, we can tackle that there, just because I think it may be a bit of a longer response. Chinese name that I can't pronounce. You can use TinyDB instead of SQLite, which is using JSON data. You probably can. I've not used TinyDB before. Archer Lee, is it possible to use an SPA with Flask? You can use an SPA with Flask, but normally I wouldn't do that. I would use Flask as an API and the SPA as its own app. Thanks, Bob. I'll see you later, but definitely this will be recorded. Well, this is being recorded and it will be on the channel later on. India 2050, is it compulsory to learn Python with HTML for web development? Yes, you need HTML for web development. You don't need Python. You can use something else instead. But yeah. Okay, so we can continue. So now we've got most of the main part of our application, really. We can serve the users with some HTML content. We can get user input, and we can save it into a list. You could save it into a SQLite database or a MongoDB or Postgres or whatever you want instead. And then you can display them back to your users. So all good there for now. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go over to oldapp.py and we're going to essentially copy the entries, append there with a date, and we're going to paste it in there. And of course, we do need to import datetime. Good practice, by the way, to import standard library or included modules at the top and then followed by libraries that you've installed yourself. Just a small tidbit there. And now we're going to be saving into our entries the content of the entry as well as the dates. All right, so this is going to be most of the Python code that we're going to write. The next part of this workshop is going to relate to the HTML and the CSS code. It's generally bad practice to put CSS code in the head, just because it can get pretty long and then you won't be able to see your HTML. It's a good idea to keep them separated. So in Flask, we normally would create another folder outside of templates, so just at the top level, called static. And inside static, I'm going to create CSS. And inside CSS, I'm going to create style.css. And now in home.html, we're going to tell this file to open that file. So what will happen is the browser is going to receive this HTML file, and then the browser is going to see that you want this CSS file, and it's going to make another request to open it. And the way we do that is we do link, and this is another tag. The rel attribute is going to be style sheet, and the href attribute is going to be the static file. So here you can do something like /static/css/style.css, and then this is also a self-closing tag. So there we've got our tag. That's just the link for the style sheet, and that links to the path of the CSS file. How do I know that this is a valid path? You can copy it. Well, you can put something here like title font size is 24 pixels like we had earlier on. Now I'm going to copy this path, go over to the browser, and now I'm going to paste it in here. And you can see that the CSS file comes back. So we know that we've accessed the right file there. We're going to go back, and now we can refresh this page. Oh, just like this though. And you'll see that absolutely nothing has changed. And the reason for it is because the CSS will be cached. So here's what's going on. We've got our HTML file that is linked to this CSS file, and the CSS file has some content. But whenever we open the CSS file, if I right click and inspect, you'll see that it didn't change before. And we can go into this network tab here and see if the CSS file is being collected or not. And you can see the head there is does not contain the link. And what we have to do is go over to our Flask app, stop it, and restart it. Okay, now if we refresh, you'll see that it changes there. Now I'm going to close the inspector there, the developer tools, and we're going to go and make another change to the CSS file. For example, we're going to do something like menu item. No, actually, we don't have this class yet. We're going to do something like this, HTML, and this is going to target the HTML tag, which is this one. And we're going to do font-family, and we're going to use Lato for this project. This is just a font, and we're going to talk about fonts in a moment as well. Now, if I go back to the site and I refresh it, I'm refreshing, but you can see that nothing's changing whatsoever. But if I open the inspector and I refresh it, then something changes. This is a big problem for new students to Flask, and the problem is here in the network tab, you have to click disable cache. Otherwise, the CSS file that you loaded earlier on is essentially remembered by your browser, and even if you change it, it will still use the old one. It does that automatically to save time, essentially. So you do have to disable cache and keep the developer tools open in order for no caching to occur. All right, so now we can go and add things to our CSS. So we've got so far the font family, and we've got this title there. But now what we're going to do is we're going to start working on this HTML and CSS combination. So a good step initially is to go ahead and give your different parts of the application class names so your CSS can target them. So for example, this div here that contains my menu items, I'm going to give it a class of menu. And these things that are the menu items, I'm going to give them a class of menu-item. And I'm going to do the same for this one there. Then we've got a main application container. So I'm going to give it a class of container. That way our CSS is going to be able to target it later on. Okay. Then we've got our div class entries. We are inside the for loop going to create a div for each entry. So we'll create a div class entry. And inside this entry, we're going to have a div with a class of entry title. And here is going to essentially have the title of the entry. And then it's going to have the paragraph, which is down here, for the entry content. So you can see that now we've got a few more things going on in our HTML code, but the purpose of these things is to essentially establish some naming for things so that we can go and change them later on. Now, there's also something called semantic HTML, which we're not going to get into in a lot of detail, but div elements are blocks. They are essentially containers for other stuff, and they don't have any meaning. If you see a block, a div element, it doesn't tell you whether it's a header or a footer or some sort of other content inside a website. And therefore, when you're using accessibility software like screen readers, it can get a little bit confusing. It's better to use semantic HTML where possible. So instead of div, we're going to use the header tag, which is a special tag, very similar to the div, but that does give a bit more information when you're using a accessibility tool. And I would recommend learning more about semantic HTML later on when you learn more about web development. Okay, something else that we're going to do is in our static folder, I'm going to create a new folder called assets. And in this folder, we're going to essentially copy the logo. Now, the logo is just what you saw in the design earlier on, down here. So it's this thing here. And we're going to use it on our site instead of the logo text. So let's look at how you can include an image into your title there. What you want to do is you're going to want to use the img tag, and we're going to give it a class of logo, of course, because you do want a class. And then it's going to have an src attribute. This is the source attribute of the thing that you want to load and show inside this image. And the source is going to be, of course, /static/assets/logo.svg. Now, the image tag is also a self-closing tag, so we're going to leave it at that. Okay. Now, if we go back to the site and we refresh, you'll see that nothing changes because we have to start and stop our application. Like that. And now we've got there our logo. Notice that the logo is shown on its full size of the image that I included, but you can change the size using CSS. So let's go and write some CSS now that we've got a lot of our HTML out of the way. We're going to go over to the CSS, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to work on our header. So the header, as you can see, has a few properties that you need to pay close attention to when you're designing your project. The header is not on the left of the page. The header also has some space between it and the top of the page. In fact, it's got 50 pixels. And the header has a width of 640 pixels, and it is centered within the window. So let's start with those things. So the header has a max width of 640 pixels. And it has a margin of 50 pixels and auto. So what does this mean? If the header wanted to be larger than 640 pixels, then it cannot. And we're adding a margin. If you remember from the box model that I'll bring back up here, we've got the box model there. The margin is some space that is outside the element. So you've got the content, you've got the padding, the border, and then the margins at the end. By doing margin 50px auto, what it's doing is adding 50 pixels at the top and at the bottom, and it's going to make the margins at the sides as big as possible, both sides, so that eventually the element is going to be centered in the screen. So there you have it. Now we have our margin is as big as possible on both sides. You can see if I open up the header there, that it's got the same margin on the left and right, and that margin is as big as possible while still leaving enough room for the content to be there, which is 640 pixels. Then it's also got 50 pixels at the top and at the bottom of space 2. Okay. By the way, guys, I didn't notice we've got 600 viewers, so thank you guys for joining in. Really appreciate everybody joining. Remember, you can sign up to the YouTube channel if you're finding this interesting. Every few months, I say the same thing, that we're going to be posting more, and we never do, but we will post more this time. we've actually got a pretty sweet series on Python development that we are working on for the next few months. So it would be really awesome to have you guys around for that. But anyway, so we've got our header. Now we have ourselves a small problem, which actually I forgot to mention, which is that we've used divs for everything in here. And divs, as you know, are block elements, which means that they take up 100% of the width. So we've got our title, and the image is an inline element, so it does not take up 100% of the width, but the div with class title does take up 100% of the width. Therefore, it is impossible for the menu items to be in the same line. And then indeed, each menu item is also taking up all the width, so it can't be side by side. And if you remember, our design here has them side by side. So if you use divs and you don't change their display property, it will just show up like this. So what we're going to do next is we're going to change the display property, of course. So we're going to be using Flex. And Flex is one of these things that is a little bit complicated, can be a little bit confusing. It's very easy to overuse, but it's so powerful that you kind of just have to know about it. So in our header, we're going to do display flex. And what this is going to do is it's going to use this flex layout instead of the old default block and inline layout. Now, I would love to be able to link you guys to some sort of awesome guide written by me on Flex, but really, there is nothing better than a complete guide to Flexbox from CSS Tricks. So hopefully they don't mind me linking to them. This is awesome. If you're going to ever use CSS, I Google this daily, basically. So what this guide tells you is essentially gives you a guide of what it is and how it works. And then it also gives you all of the different properties that you can use with Flex for your elements. So the gist of it is that when you use Flex, you're laying out your elements in 2D, 2 dimensions. So left to right or top to bottom. Or maybe that's 1D, I'm not sure. But anyway, you can see that once you've defined display flex, you can then do flex direction, and the elements inside your container are going to be laid out in some sort of row or reversed row or column or reversed column. And you've got loads of different things that you can do with Flex. But essentially, this is a layout engine that is a bit more modern than previous layout engines. And it's really awesome. So let's take a look at how we can use it. We're going to do display flex in our header. And then we're going to do flex direction is row, because we want the elements to be aligned left to right. So we're going to save this, go back to our site. Now you can see that the recent and the calendar are side by side. And if you go to the body and open up the header, you'll see that now the elements here, these divs, are no longer taking up 100% of the available space. These elements are indeed taking up only the space they need for their content. Okay, so we've got that so far. Let's go back into our code. And now what we're going to do is justify content space between. And what this is going to do is going to go ahead and push these elements to the right. Really what space between is doing is it's making sure that between any elements inside a flex container, so that is, the header is the flex container, and it has 2 elements inside it, the title and the menu. Justify content space between is making sure that between these 2 elements there is as much space as possible. So that is why they are pushed to the very edges of the available space. If you had 3 elements, then it would make sure that the space between any 2 elements is the same. So this element would be in the middle and the other element would be on the right. Again, If you take a look at a complete guide to Flexbox, which I recommend, you'll see that in here, you've got a justify content section with a bunch of images describing what it is, and we're using space between, which pushes the elements to the sides and makes the space between them as large as possible. You've got things like space around, which makes sure that the space around each element is always the same. So this element has some space around it, and so there's this one, and so there's this one, and so on. So there's a bunch of stuff that you can do with it, but space between is what we want here because we want the menu to be on the right and the title to be on the left. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take away this font size 24 pixels from the title, and instead we're going to put it on the header. When we do that, all the elements in the header are going to use this new font size, so you can see that recent and calendar as well as microblog are now using that. Okay, then we're going to go ahead and do header.title, and the title element is this div here that contains the image as well as the microblog text. We are also going to give it a display of flex, and now we're going to do align items center. And this is going to go ahead and align these two to the middle of the, I think that's the main axis. So both of these are now centered with each other, and we have to do the same for these two. So remember, we set the header to have a display of flex, which means that this div and this div are taking up only as much space as their content needs. But these divs are still taking up 100% of the available width, which means they will appear stacked one on top of another. If you want to change that, you have to give this display of flex and then a flex direction of row so that these two elements will appear side by side. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to do header.menu, display of flex, a flex direction of row, and we're also going to do align items center, just so they are centered in their available space across the axis. So if we go back and we refresh, now you can see that we've got all our things laid out nicely. So a couple of things that we need to do. We need to add a bit of space between these two things. We need to add a bit of space between these two things. And we need to change the color of them so that they are slightly gray. So let's go and do that. In the menu item, we're going to set the color to 5C6B70. Love that color. It's one of my favorites. And now you can see that they've gone a bit gray there. Then we're going to go back and we're going to add this space. So how we're going to add this space is we're going to do header.title.img. And actually I'm realizing now that I didn't explain how this works. So I do apologize for that. But this works. this clearly works. So what's going on here, by the way, that I just my assumed knowledge, I apologize about that. When you do header and then you put a space and then you do .title, it's targeting the element with the class title inside of the header element. And when you do header space .title space img, it's going to target the img element inside an element with class title, which must be inside the header element. So that's how that's working. We're targeting the header, then the title, and then the img tag. So sorry about that, forgot to mention, but that's sort of how it's going. And you're going to do margin right of 30 pixels there. And now when we go back to our site, you'll see that you do have some space there. And again, this is a massive because we're 200% zoom, but we're going to zoom out later on. We also want to add some spacing here. So what we're going to do is we're just going to add a bit of spacing on the left of recent and a bit of spacing on the left of calendar. So we're going to go ahead and target our menu items and just give them a bit of margin left. So we will do header.menu, so target the menu class inside the header, and then inside that target a menu item and give them a margin left of 50 pixels. Okay. So by the way, color sets the color of the text, and then the margin dash left, of course, sets the left side margin, margin right sets the right side margin, and so on. So going back and refreshing, now we've got a bit of space there. At a normal zoom, this is going to look a little bit better. Like that. What kind of VS Code theme? I'm actually using the default VS Code theme for Dark Plus. Oh, Shady, you left a few minutes ago. Thanks for tuning in, man. I will send you the recording later on. So there we go. There we go. Now we've got our header all styled up. And the things that we've learned while doing that are going to be really useful for the rest of the page as well. So the next part is to get this container that is the host of our form and our entries, and make sure that it is, again, centered on the page with a small maximum width. Simon, I will send you the recording as well. This will all be in the Discord channel. We'll post it in the Discord channel later on. It'll also be in the YouTube channel under the videos there. So do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and join us in the Discord. What game is this? This is the awesome microblog coding game where you get to code your own blog, Frederick, and it's really cool. So, for the container, we're going to do .container to target the container. We're going to target the container element. And in here, we're going to set the max width to 450 pixels. And we're going to set the margin to 0 auto. So exactly what we did earlier on for the header, but now with a slightly smaller max width so that there is a bit of space between the left side of the header and the right side of the header and the body, just as there is in the design. Okay, so next up, we're gonna style the text area, which is actually something a lot of people struggle with when they're starting. It is a lot of people, myself included, when I started, I thought, inputs are system dependent. Windows styles your inputs in a certain way, and so does Mac, and you probably can't style them yourself. But actually, you absolutely can. Everything in HTML is made up of these elements, borders and margins and paddings and background colors and so forth, so you can style them. Sanket, what does flex direction property do? Flex direction, the property flex direction does this. It lays out your elements left to right or right to left if you use row reverse, or top to bottom or bottom to top if you use column or column reverse. Akil, if you have a computer graphics exam tomorrow, I'm not sure this is going to help you. I wish it would. But thank you for tuning in, though. You probably should be studying. All right, so for the form, we have to do something first, which is we have to make sure that the form items are not in this weird-ass way. We want the submit button to be underneath and aligned to the right. So, like that. What we're going to do is, of course, we're going to use flex for it. So, we'll do form display flex. Flex direction is going to be column, because we want the items to be top to bottom. But if we do this, you'll see that this does not look like what you wanted. Because by default, the alignment of items in flex is to stretch so that they fill the entire space of the flex container. And we don't want that. We want the items to be aligned to the right. So we're going to do that. We're going to go in here and say align items, flex end. And now when we do that, you'll see that the items are no longer stretched. They're there. Okay. Okay, let's move on into the next bit, which is the text area. So we will do form text area. And here we're going to do width 100%. Width 100% is going to force the text area, or whatever element really, to be as wide as possible, as wide as space there is in the parent. So the text area is inside the form. The form is inside the container. The container's max width is 450 pixels. So the form will be 450 pixels, and the text area will also be 450 pixels. So if we now go back to our site, you'll see that now this text area has grown. Now let's get to styling the text area. We're going to do that the font family is going to be Lato, and the font size is going to be 18 pixels. Then we're going to save, and we're going to go and have a look at it. Why am I doing this? Well, you can see now that when I click into the text area, you can see the cursor is right up to the side of the text area. But, and indeed, if you start typing, type something here, you can see that we've changed the font, which is awesome. This now looks more like the web font. But you can see in our design that there is more gap between the left and the top than we have in our application. That means that we want to add some spacing between this content and this border. And as you guys know already, what we want to add is padding, because the content is the text of the text area and the border is the outside line. We want to add some padding that will separate the border from the content. One of the key things about padding as well is that the padding will use the same background color as the content, but the margin will not, because margin is not part of the component, it's just space around it. Zman, if I'm saying your name right, that is correct. Well, almost correct, except for the equal sign. So we're going to separate the stuff. We're going to do padding and then colon 12px and 20px. And this is a 12px at the top and the bottom, 20px at the left and right. So we'll do this. And then we'll go back here. Now you can see that as we type something, then there is a bit more gap. However, we've fallen foul of a problem that I described in the presentation earlier on. So if you missed it, don't worry, we're going to go over it again, which is that, I'm not sure if you noticed that something else changed. If I remove the padding, at the moment the text area's border is here on the left, more or less in line with the logo. But if I refresh, now it's not. Now it is much more separated from the logo. Indeed, I'm going to right-click and inspect this element, and when you do that, you can see that there is some size of the text area that is quite small, and that it says 456 pixels wide just beside the text area. I would love to point at it, but as soon as I move my cursor, it's going to disappear, so I can't. But it's right there in the middle, right there. 456 by 48.86. So, okay, first problem. Why is it 456 and not 450, like we told it to, right? That's the max width, right? And why did it get bigger when we added padding? Well, that is the other thing that we talked about in this presentation. That the default size of elements only takes the content into account. So when we do max width, 450 pixels, the content's max width is 450. If we then add a border, like we are doing right now, then that adds some extra size to the element. And if we add some padding, like we did just a moment ago, then that makes the element even bigger. So what we want to do is we want to do box sizing border box. Then the max width of the element will be taken from the border line as opposed to the content line. So down here, we're going to bring the padding back, and we're going to do box sizing border box. Notice that the alternative is content box, which is the default. So we're going to do box sizing border box. And now when we go back to our site, you'll see that it stays in the same place, more or less. But now the content does have the spacing around it. Awesome. Okay, now let's continue with the design. We're going to do border none. Border none just gets rid of the border. So by saving that and going back into our site, you'll see that now the borders disappear. The thing is still here, but you can't see the border. And then we're going to set the background color to match the design's color. So that's F3, F6, F6. And we're going to add some margin bottom of 10 pixels to separate the text area from the button slightly. there we go. Now we have a text area there that looks more or less like the design one. A couple of things that you should not get rid of, by the way. Don't try to get rid of this resizing icon there. It's pretty fucked, actually. But we'll forget about that one for now. And don't try to get rid of the blue border that appears when you click on it. That's there for accessibility purposes. You shouldn't try to remove it. So thank you for tuning in, Chinese dudes whose name I can't pronounce. Hope you've liked it so far. Thanks for your contribution in the chat as well. All right, so yeah, don't use that thing. That's broken. It's totally not our fault. We've probably done something to break it, but anyway, minor details. Okay, so we've got that. Let's move on to the submit. I'm so confused by Coating's message in the chat. And the submit button. So we're going to do form. And now we're going to target the submit button. So that's an input. However, this is generally bad practice because you can have many different types of inputs and you don't want to format all your inputs in the same way. So a good idea is to target the input that has a specific type or a specific attribute. And you can do that with square brackets and then say type equal submit. And what that's going to do is this rule set here is only going to affect the input that has this attribute. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to set the background color to 3CD0FF. That's that blue. We're going to remove the border. We're going to set the font size to 18 pixels. We're going to set the font family to Lato. We're going to set the font weight to bold, and we're going to set some padding of 5 pixels and 30 pixels. So again, that's 5 on the top and bottom, 30 left and right. And we're going to look at a new property called border radius, and we're going to make it 20 pixels. So now I'm going to show you something else, which is that when we refresh, of course, this button now looks like the button should look like, except the text is black instead of white. But also you can right-click on any element and inspect it. And then you'll see down here on the right that you've got your styles. And these styles, you can check them and uncheck them if you want to manipulate an element directly in the browser without having to code it and then refresh it and then code it again and then refresh it again. In addition, if you click down here, you can set the attributes directly yourself and you can see the element changes. So it's pretty cool. You can try things out in the browser directly without having to, code it all up. So now we know that this is what we want. We're going to do that, and we're going to copy the color white. Just copy that and go over to here and paste it in there. So now we've got the button, but something that we're missing from this button is a hover style. So you can see that now when we, for example, hover over this text area, the cursor changes to this typing cursor. But when we hover over the button, it does not. Indeed, nothing happens. You don't know that this is clickable, although it is, because when you click on it, you see the border. But we can do better than that. We can add some styling that will change the color and the cursor when you hover over the button. So what you want to do is you want to target the same element, but now you're going to use a modifier. And there's quite a few of these, but one of them is hover. And what that means is that you're going to target this input when it's being hovered. Okay, so what we'll do here is we'll change the background color. We're going to change it to 18B1E1, which is a slightly darker blue. And we're going to set cursor to pointer. And this is going to change the cursor to a little hand when you're hovering over this item. Remember that the CSS hovering is taken care of by the browser, so you don't have to worry about where the button is or anything like that. So now we have our nice button there. Hover versus focus, what's the difference? So focus is when an element has is currently selected. So for example, right now, the text area is selected even though I'm not hovering it. And right now the button is selected even though I'm not hovering it. I'm changing focus using the tab key. but it can be focused without being hovered, and it can also be hovered without being focused. So yeah, that's the reason. Okay. Next up, let's have a look at the entries. So we're gonna type something here. Hello world. Let's see. And we get this beautiful entry with all the stuff that we wanted. So now clearly we're gonna have to do a bit of work here. So we've got title of the entry. This is clearly hard coded in our HTML. And then we've got the entire dictionary that the entry was about. So we want to change things around a little bit. Let's go back into the HTML and do that first. So we're going to go to home.html. And then here, instead of title of the entry, we're going to make use of Jinja 2. Jinja 2 is really quite powerful. And what we're going to do here is we're going to do entry content. This accesses the content key of the entry dictionary, and Jinja 2 knows about dictionaries, mostly because it's written to be quite similar to some bits of Python code, so it knows about that. But what you can do with Jinja 2 is not only can you access the content key of the entry dictionary, but you can also tell it to only show up to a certain number of characters. So we're going to do pipe. This is this icon there. It's not an L, it's the pipe bottom left key in my keyboard. I don't know what it's in yours, but nonetheless, the pipe symbol, you'll probably find it on Google if you don't know where it is. And then we're going to type truncate 30 and true. And so what this is going to do is it's going to take the entry content, but only up to 30 characters. If you don't pass through here, then it's going to show up to 30 characters, but it's going to make sure to end at the boundary between two words instead of just showing 30 characters. And then after the truncation, if the content is larger than 30 characters, it's going to show an ellipsis, 3 dots, to show you that there's more to it. Then in the entry content, we're going to just use the full content. Okay. Now, something else we're going to do with the date is we're going to show it beside the title, just as we require from our design. So you can see that our design here has the title, then we've got this symbol there, and then we've got the date, and this is a different color as well. So we're going to go back into our HTML, and we're going to create a span, and this is where you might want to use a span. Spans are inline elements, so that means that you can fit them inside an existing element, and they won't try to take up all the available width. They won't break up the element into new lines. And what we're going to do is we're going to put that symbol in there. I don't know how you type this symbol, so I'm going to copy it. And then we're going to do entry date. Just like that. Now the span can also take a class. So we're going to do entry-date as the class name for that. Also, something important to remember is that in HTML, the new lines don't matter. So you can divide your divs into multiple lines if that helps you understand them a bit more easily. So now we have our entry content, which is up to 30 characters long, and then we've got our entry date, which shows this symbol and the date. That means that we can target the date on its own to change the color if we want, because we've got an element with a class name around it. Okay, let's go back to style.css. Well, actually, first of all, let me go in here and restart my application first. Let me stop that. Start it again. We are going to refresh. Now we're going to type hello world. Submit. You can see we get hello world. That's less than 30 characters, so there is no truncation going on. And then we've got the entire hello world message. But if we type a long message, such as, for example, today I learned how to bring in 600 viewers into a programming stream. That's awesome. Then you'll see that we now get some truncation there. If you passed true to the truncate filter, that's what it's called, then it would stop at 2 because this is not a full word. And then you get the rest of the message down here, and you've got your date there. Shady, I am very glad that you are here. Welcome back. The weather is pretty shit, actually. It's so bad outside. that I also would not go outside, even if I usually did. So let's bring back our code. And we're going to now format these entries or style these entries a bit better. And so what we're going to start with is a entry. Oh, by the way, let me show you first what we're changing. So at the moment, we've got a few things going on here. These entries are very close to one another. So we're going to add a little bit of spacing between two of them. So that's going to make use of margin top. So we're going to take the entry and we're going to do margin top 50 pixels. So the entry, again, is each of the individual elements that we're creating for each entry. So we're going to add a bit of margin on top of these. Then we're going to take the entry title and we're going to give it a font size of 16 pixels. Okay, so let's take a look at what that looks like up till now. There you go. Slightly smaller. Notice that I pressed refresh and that created a new entry automatically because I arrived at this site through submitting the form. So that's something you should take care in not to do normally. So now we have a bit more space there. Let's turn this into the gray that it should be, this gray here. So we will do entry date, color, it's going to be 5C6B70. And now if we go back here, and I'm going to press that, to not create any more entries, you've ended up with the gray there. Now the content should be slightly smaller. So we're going to reduce the font size of the entry content, but also something that you should take care to not do when you're designing websites that contain a lot of text is the text should not be too close together. The lines should not be too short, because that can make text a bit difficult to read, but the lines should also not be too long, because that can also make them difficult to read. I'm just going to separate these two lines slightly. I find it a bit more readable. So we're going to go back into our CSS, change the entry content, font size is going to be 14 pixels, and the line height is going to be 150%. So instead of 100%, which would be 14, it's going to be 150%, which is 21. Oof, quick maths. So now if we do that, you can see that we've got a little bit of more gap there and the text is a bit smaller. All right, so now we are almost at a stage where we can zoom out and it will look okay. It does look a bit small though. I mean, you can increase font sizes and whatnot if you like. At the moment, I do feel this looks a bit small, so maybe I would increase font sizes. I am on a 4K screen, so everything does look a bit janky sometimes. So there we go. We've got our header, we've got our form there, and you've got your different entries, and you can write more. And then they get stored in the in-memory database that we're using at the moment, which is a Python list. By the way, guys, if you haven't already, go ahead and like this live stream. That really helps out the channel. And you can subscribe as well if you are so inclined. That would be awesome. Man, I have so many lights, and you're still saying that my face lights up when I open Chrome. Anyway, I hope that you guys are not suffering too much from the light theme here. Cool. So the final thing that we've got left to do in our HTML is the footer. So we've got the footer down here. And this is just has a couple of links and whatnot. A couple of interesting things about this footer is that it takes up the entire width, but of course the content inside the footer does not. So you have to do some stuff there with HTML elements that will be interesting to learn about. So let's go and create this footer. What we're going to do is go ahead into our HTML file. And now outside of the container, because remember this container is limiting the content inside it to 450 pixels. If we put the footer inside the container, that footer is not going to occupy the entire width. So we want to put it outside of that container. We're going to put it right here.
And again, using semantic HTML for this, I'm using the footer element instead of just a div, as that is the same, but it has a bit more meaning. And in this footer, we're going to put all those links, and we're going to use divs to structure them. So the footer has two main parts. It has, first of all, a footer container. Why? Because the footer has to be the full width of the page, but the content inside the footer has to be the same width as the header. So that container is going to take care of limiting the width of the content. And then there are two parts to the footer. There's a left part and a right part. So I'll show you the two. You've got the left part here that takes up half of the footer room, and you've got the right part here which takes up the other half. And then in these, this right part has two parts as well, recent and calendar, and about and how this was made. And this one only has these two links there. So we're going to replicate this structure using HTML. In the footer container, we'll put two divs, one which I'm going to call left, and one which I'm going to call right. And then inside the left one, we're going to put an A tag, which is an anchor or a link. And that's going to be footer item. And I'm going to put made by me. You can put your name in here if you want instead. I will be okay with that. I would survive if you try to pass this as your own, but your job prospects may suffer. Check out my other projects. So we've got the left and right. So these two are the only things in the left side, but now we're going to create the right side, which has two subsections. So we're going to do div class footer section, and then we're going to duplicate it. And inside each section, we're going to put some more A tags with footer item for recent and calendar. These are essentially two links that we had in the menu, but we're going to have them down here as well, just in case users want to navigate down to the footer to see them. And here we're going to have the about and how this was made. So now we've got the footer structure. And again, using HTML, this is going to look terrible. But when we start using CSS to change it, then it's going to look a bit better. So I'm going to stop my app and restart it, and then go over to the site. And look at that. We have ourselves the footer. All the entries have disappeared because we restarted the app. But we can bring them, well, we can rewrite them later on. You can see the footer has different parts. This is one of the divs. And by the way, anchor tags are inline, so that's why they're appearing side by side. The divs are not inline, so that's why they appear stacked. So I'm going to right-click and inspect that, and you can see that we've got the footer, which takes up the entire width. Then we've got the footer container, which takes up the entire width as well. And then we've got left and right. These two are divs too, so they also take up all the width, and they appear stacked, one on top of the other. And inside the left div, we've got two anchor tags or two links. So they appear side by side because they are inline. On the right element, we've got two more divs, so they appear stacked. And inside each element, we have two A tags, so they appear side by side. Hopefully all of this makes sense up to now. Thank you guys for joining in, by the way. I hope you are enjoying the stream. Do join the Discord if you want more of this sort of interaction. You can type !Discord in the chat to get a link to the Discord server and an invite. And also make sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel and like this video if you like it, as that would be awesome and I would really appreciate it. So let's continue with this project. I'm sorry, RIP Juice World. How to I open a TXT document with Java. You know, I used to know how to do that, but I have forgotten because I haven't used Java for a long time. All right, footers. Let's format the footer. So the footer has some padding. Well, first of all, actually, the footer has a background color. Let's start with that. Let's start with the easy part. 323 F43. So we've got a background color in the footer. Let's go back here, refresh. You've got the background color. Now, we need to add some spacing at the top and bottom to separate the content from the top and the bottom of the footer. So we're going to do that. And we'll also need to add some spacing outside the footer to separate it from the button or the entries. So let's do both of those things. We're going to do padding. This is going to add space within the footer so that there is some more available room with the background color. So that's what happens there. We've added some padding at the top, but not on the left and right, because the footer container element that we have inside here is going to take care of, shrinking the content. So we don't need to add padding on the left and right. But we've got padding at the top and bottom. Now we're going to add some margin as well. So let's bring this up. We're going to do margin, 50 pixels at the top, 0 pixels at the right, 0 pixels at the bottom, and 0 pixels at the left. And this is a shorthand. You could do margin top, 50 pixels, margin right, 0 pixels, margin left, and so on. But this is a bit faster. So if you want margins like that, you can do 50px, 0, 0, 0, and that's going to just go for the top padding. So refreshing this, now you'll see that it's a bit more separated from the top. Something else in our project is that there is a border at the top of our footer. So we're going to go ahead and recreate that as well. Those borders, I think, look quite clean. I do like using borders to separate elements sometimes. So we're going to do border top. Border top sets a border property only on the top side of an element. You can do border left, right, or bottom, or you can just do border, and that sets the border on all sides. And then you've got 3 different properties. The width, or the essentially the weight of the border, 4 pixels wide in this case. The type of border, which solid means a solid line, but it can also be dashed and dotted and whatnot. And finally, the color. So we have now set that up. We can go ahead and refresh, and you'll see that we got this nice border there. Finally, the text is unreadable, so we do have to say color is white. So again, background color changes the color of the background. Color changes the color of text. Also, we're going to set font size to 12 pixels because we don't want the footer to take away from the main content of the page. Okay, so we've got that now. We have to make sure that the footer container that is inside of the footer has a maximum width and is centered. So we'll do we can do footer container. That's going to be a max width of 640 pixels, the same as the header. So remember, the header has a max width of 640 as well. And we want them to be aligned so that it looks nice. And then margin is going to be 0 auto. So by doing that, we're now getting the centered text there. However, we have now to use flex in order to lay these elements out a bit more nicely. Because the footer, as you can see, has all these full width elements, and we don't want that. So the first thing we want to do is we want the footer to be flex and have a flex direction of row. The reason for that is we want left to appear on the left and right to appear on the right, and I'm realizing that it's probably the other way around for you guys in the camera, but that's what we want. So we're going to go ahead and do display is flex, flex direction is row. When you do that, you can now see that they appear side by side. This element here is very long, takes up most of the room. These are a bit smaller in width, so they seem to be a bit smaller on the side, but that's going to be fine, don't worry. Okay, so now we have that, we can go into each of the elements within the footer. So we'll do footer.left, and in here, we're going to do flex grow 2. And then we're going to do footer.right, and we're going to do flex grow 1. What this tells flex is that this left element here should be twice as big as this one. So the ratio of these numbers will determine how much space they take up. And if you don't define flex grow, then it just takes up the space it needs. If you do define flex grow, then the combination of all elements that have flex grow will take up all the available space. So what that does now is that these elements take up the entire space. You can see how the left element and the right element both have extra room that they don't actually need on the side. That's caused by flex grow. So in combination, they take up all the available room. The left one takes up twice as much room as the right one. Okay, so we've got that. We can go ahead and now change a couple other things within the left and right. So for the left container, it's got two links inside it, and we want these links to appear one on top of the other. So the left element, we're going to do display is flex as well. Flex direction, column. Okay, so you can only set things like flex direction and in flex containers, so elements that have display flex. And that's all detailed in the CSS tricks link that I will put in the description under this video, and also, it's here. So this details everything you can do with flex, and it's pretty good. So now that we've got this, these two will appear top to bottom, just like that. But then notice how these, down there in the right, we've got a footer section that has recent and calendar, and they appear side and side because they are inline elements. And then below it, we've got the other footer section that has about and how this was made, and they also appear side to side, but we want them to appear top to bottom. So both of these sections have to be columns. So let's go and do that. For the footer right, we're going to do display flex, and flex direction is row. So wait a minute, didn't I just say it has to be column? Well, the footer sections have to be columns, but the right element has to be a row because we want these two sections to go left to right. So now we've got this going left to right. If we make this into a column and this into another column, they are going to appear top to bottom exactly as we want it in the final design. So that's that for the right. Then we'll do footer section, and we'll do display is flex, flex direction is column, and now it's starting to look more like what we wanted. There we have recent calendar and about and how this was made. Okay, we're almost there. We have just a couple more things. We want some space between the sections, so we're going to do margin left 50 pixels. And that is going to give us some space in here. There you go. Perfect. Now, we also want some space between this item and this one. Some separation, and between this one and this one, and between this one and this one. So what do all of these elements have in common? Well, they are all footer item. So if we go back to our code, we can do dot footer item, and we do margin bottom 5 pixels. And that is just going to take care of adding a little bit of spacing between the elements, just like that. So now, as you can see, it looks pretty good. There's no entries, of course, but it looks almost the same, if not the same. All right, let's remove this person. We have to do this. Yay, we got rid of him. Guys, why do we have 6 dislikes? Like, come on. All right. Yeah, you can tag me if you think we should ban somebody. I'm okay with banning people. All right. So, guys, remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel. And yeah, probably Dane, probably the people we keep banning, keep disliking the video. I mean, why would they do that? Okay, so we've got most of the stuff now. What else are we missing? Are we missing something? We are missing one thing, which is that the footer, as you can see right now on the site, is in the middle of the page. And as we add content to the page, then the footer moves down. This can be okay. And, you know, a lot of websites do this. Normally, you're not going to have an empty content because we're going to be loading and unloading, not unloading, we're just going to be loading these entries from a database. So normally this is not going to be a problem, but you can move this footer and have it stuck to the bottom of the page. In the code in GitHub, that footer is stuck to the bottom of the page. So you can check that out in the description of this video if you want to learn how, but we're not going to look at it here. It just adds a bit more complexity there. For now, what we're going to do is we're going to save and retrieve our entries from a SQLite database. I mean, I promised this to you guys. We were going to learn how to store these things on a database, so we're going to do that. All right. So if we want to store things in a database, I'm going to stop the app, by the way, at the moment. If we want to store things in a database, we need to decide, first of all, what structure the database is going to have. So, at the moment, our entries have two things inside them. They have the content and they have the date. So we're going to stick to storing exactly this data that we've got in our database. What I like to do is I like to go ahead and create another file and call it something like database.py. And in here, we're going to define our interactions with the database. So if you've never used a SQL database before, a SQL database has tables, and each table has columns. In each column, you can you can create new rows, and each column can have a value in each of the cells of the new row. So I will show you something that we've been working on. Something we've been working on that is not ready yet for anybody to use, but you've got this thing here, and this is essentially how a relational database works. You've got your tables, these are the columns, and these are the rows. Each row has some value for each of the columns. So I will be linking this later on if you're in the Discord server. I won't be linking it on YouTube because it's still a work in progress. But nonetheless, we're going to be creating a table that looks kind of like this one with our entry and date. And then we're going to be saving and retrieving from that. So a couple of things that we need to know about before we can insert and retrieve data. We need to know how to create a table. That's pretty straightforward. You just type create table and then the table name and then the different types of data in your table. So we're going to have the content and the date. They're both going to be text in our case. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to have create table, and this is going to be a query that says create table entries with the content text and the date text. So this is the query that we're going to run on our database to create the table we need in order to store the data. So how do we run a query? First of all, we have to connect to the database. And if you're using Python, you can connect to a SQLite database without having to install anything. Pretty easily, just do connection equals SQLite3.connect. And I like connecting to something called data.db. You do have to import SQLite 3. SQLite is a relational database that is light in that it has a couple of limitations compared to something like Postgres. But when you connect and you give it something like data.db, what it's going to do is it's going to create a file, and that file is going to contain your database, so all your tables and data and whatnot. It's one of the benefits of SQLite that everything is stored in a single file. It means you can delete it and recreate it very easily and whatnot. So we're going to do this. This means we've connected with the database. Then we're going to create a function called create tables. And what this is going to do is it's going to do with connection and then connection.execute create table. So what this is doing is it's going to use the connection that we've got here to execute the query, which is then going to create our table. Something important with relational databases is, as well as executing your queries, you have to make sure that those queries are then saved into the file. And by using with connection, by using this context manager, it's going to do that for you. If you don't use the context manager, then it's not going to do that for you. You have to do it yourself. So that ebook that we're currently working on, that I will link in the Discord server, contains a lot of explanations on what everything is, and you can go ahead and read it by joining the Discord server, and you have to type !Discord in the chat. All right, so this is going to create the tables. Now we need something to insert data. So create entry, and this one is going to be insert into entries, and we're going to insert 2 values. So the values are going to be question mark and question mark. Of course, when we create the function create entry, this is going to receive the content, the content and the date as 2 parameters, and then it's going to use the connection to execute this query. So we'll do connection.execute, create entry. And now we don't want to enter question mark and question mark, of course. We do want to enter the contents of these 2 variables that we've received here. So after the query that we want to create, we put a comma, and then we pass in another argument, which is a tuple of values, where each value will be replaced into a question mark. So like that, we've got a tuple of content and date. Content will go into the first question mark, date will go into the second question mark, and because there are 2 values there, the same number of values as columns in our table, then they will be mapped correctly. Okay? Because we're using the context manager, this will be saved into the database as well. The Discord is not working. Nightbot keeps not working. Phil, can you get people a link if you have a moment? Actually, yeah, it's in the description of the video. Never mind. If you click down in the description of this video, you can find a link. All right, so now we've got the ability to insert entries into this database. The final thing is we need to retrieve the entries. So we'll do retrieve entries. And what this is going to do is use the connection to create a cursor. And a cursor is something that we can use to go through elements. So here, what is a cursor? So the cursor is this arrow. And we're going to create a cursor. We're going to load into the cursor all our entries from the database, and then we can use the cursor to go through them one by one. It's just a memory efficient way of iterating over a result set that's coming back from a database. So with the connection, we're going to do cursor equal connection.cursor. Then the cursor we're going to use to execute the query that we haven't created. So we'll do retrieve entries is going to be select star from entries. That's it. It's just going to select everything from the entries table that we've created earlier on. Retrieve entries. There we go. And then we're going to return cursor.fetch all. And what that's going to do is going to use the cursor to get all of the rows from the result set. So there you go. VS Code helping out as well with some documentation. And that's going to give us everything. So why do I like creating this database.py? Because now the database interaction is all inside this file, and our app does not have to concern itself with how it works. So what we're going to do is from database, we're going to import everything. So actually, I'm just going to do import database instead. And now what we're going to do is, before we even think about the endpoints, we're going to do database.create tables. So we're going to create the tables of our database. Then when we want to append to the entries, instead of appending, we're going to do database.addEntry. Add entry, is that what it's called? Create entry. There we go. Create entry. And we're going to create the entry content and the date is going to be this stuff that we have here. Now we can get rid of this, if I can click the right key. And finally, entries is going to be equal to a database dot retrieve entries. That's going to go into the database and get everything back. We can get rid of this list there. All right, that's it. That's really everything you have to do. So let's run our app. You can see that instantly data.db gets created because we created the table before even like launching any endpoints or even accessing any endpoints with our browser. So now when we go into the browser, which we will do here, I'm going to refresh this page there. Oh, we've got an error. Something went wrong. That is unfortunate. Let me see. We have ourselves an error, and this is fairly common, of course, when you're doing programming. So it's not liking the, I think it's not liking the shared connection. So that sort of makes sense. My apologies for that problem. So there is a problem that we've encountered here. And the problem is that we connected to the database once, but Flask runs in multi-threaded environment. So when you create the connection in one thread and then you try to access it in another thread, it doesn't like that. So apologies about that. All we have to do is this instead. So we will have to connect to the database in each function instead of sharing a connection between them all. So Dane, it may not be letting you post the Discord link. That is a possibility. All right, let's try that again. See if we can get it to work. You can see that we get now an error because the table already exists. So you do have to delete data.db before running the app again. So let's hope it now works. You can see, guys, that I haven't planned this database section. I don't have the code for it beside me. So this is all live coding, and things can go wrong when you do live coding. So now we have this. We can type something out. Live coding some SQL stuff with Flask. Let's submit. And we have ourselves the dot. So the reason why we're getting this dot back is because earlier on in our app.py, we were storing dictionaries in the list. And when we were sending that list to home.html, it had a list of dictionaries. But now we don't have a list of dictionaries anymore. The database retrieve entries actually returns a list of tuples. So we do have to go into home.html and make sure that instead of entry date, we do entry 1, and instead of entry content, we do entry 0. Just to use the right type of data for the entry. Let's stop that and try again. But now we have created the table, which we have to delete. Let's try that again. And there we go. And I'm going to tell you guys how to not get that error, of course, when you are creating your table over and over. James, the Discord link is in the description of the video. So if you scroll down a wee bit and click on show more on YouTube, it'll tell you the Discord link there. Coding SQLite 3 interactions with Flask. For example, there we go. So now we've got our stuff sitting in the database. If we refresh the page, that is still there. But if we terminate the app and we run it again, you'll see that we get the error where the table entries already exists. So what you can do in your database.py is you can create table if not exists. So beautiful English language words there, and then that gets rid of the error. So it'll only try to create this table if it's not already there. Yeah, I think we have some spam protection in the chat. And so there you go. The app was refreshed, but these microblog entries are still there because we have saved them into the database. So there you go. There you go. A simple app using Flask that has a single endpoint, but looks pretty cool. And you could actually put this into your portfolio if you were doing some sort of web development. It looks pretty nice. And it works. You can then take this further and store things into a more powerful database like Postgres or something like that, but it would be pretty straightforward once you know how Postgres works. So a couple of moments to plug the next course that is coming out. So the Complete Python and PostgreSQL course 2.0 is coming out over the next few months. It's going to be a pretty amazing course, and we're putting a lot of work into it, and it's going to cover Python, relational databases, and Postgres, how they work together, a lot of advanced topics. We're also going to be looking a bit at NoSQL databases and some serverless deployments and how to graph things. It's going to be awesome. So if you're interested in that course, do sign up to the Discord server or maybe to our mailing list, which is in the blog which is at blog.tecladocode.com. This ebook is at pysequel.tecladocode.com if you want to have a look at that while we work on it. And if you want to learn more about Python web development, let me know in the chat. Maybe we can do another of these sessions where we implement the calendar, which is the next step in the project, which I think looks pretty nice. Looks a bit like the Windows 10 calendar, but hey, I didn't say that. I didn't design this. Totally didn't copy from Windows 10. So yeah, if you guys have any feedback or any comments you want to make, now's the time to be making them, because we are at the end of this session. So thank you guys for joining. I'll stick around for a while and answer any questions you guys have. If you've got some code that you want me to look at or something like that, and then just send it to me in the Discord server or the chat, and we can take a look. Yeah, I'm on low latency mode on YouTube, but the latency is not that low. There's a bit of latency with the chat. So thank you guys. Thank you, Andy. Keep going. So we need to prepare the next part of the workshop, but I'll be sharing this link. Actually, I'll share this link right now on the chat for the code. So we have the code that I'm going to send you right now. Just going to share it in the chat. So if you want to have a look at the code, then you can do in just a moment. Although the code that I'm going to be sharing with you guys doesn't have the database stuff, but I will push it up in a minute when I've had the chance. So anyway, the address is here. So you can use that link to get the code if you want it. So thank you guys. Jasper Pants, thank you. Hadi Nasser, thank you. Dan, Patrick, James. Thanks guys. Doug. And Falk. Utah, thank you. Thank you for tuning in. And Golam Rabi, Ian, thank you. You can always check out the code that is linked up there, and also the recorded version will be on the channel in just a little bit. So thank you guys. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Like this video and join the Discord server. Buy the courses. There's loads of things you could be doing. So yeah, thank you. All right, thanks guys. Any questions or anything like that, just put them in the Discord server will be going offline now. I think I need to rest my voice a bit. So yeah, cheers guys. Thanks for joining, and I'll see you in the next one.